Daddy, it's my first time, and your pencil feels too big for me. Hi, my name is Lily, and I'm 18 years old. My life has always been calm and private. It's just me and my dad because my mom left us many years ago. She disappeared suddenly, almost as if she'd vanished into thin air, leaving behind cold, empty rooms that my father and I filled with the warmth of our care. We've always been like two ships, navigating the same storm, supporting each other through every challenge. A few months ago, I started attending university. For someone like me, who was used to the comfort and predictability of our small world, it was a huge leap forward. Lectures, new faces, and bustling hallways. It was all exciting, but also intimidating. My father was proud of me, but I could tell how much he struggled with being alone. Each time I came back home, his smile had a way of brightening my entire day. Soon, though, the demands of university life took over. I began attending parties, initially out of sheer curiosity. The environment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Blaring music, unfamiliar people, and an overwhelming sense of freedom that seemed to fill the air. It was an entirely new chapter of life that I'd never known before. After one of my first parties, I came home in the dead of night. My dad was in the kitchen, sipping tea while waiting for me. His gaze was soft, but I sensed an underlying worry. "How was the party?" he asked, attempting to sound casual. "Fun," I replied, keeping the details vague. He nodded, and the room fell silent. There was an odd tension lingering between us, but I decided not to dwell on it. Every time I went out in the evening, that same feeling crept in, as if he feared that the world beyond our home might change me. That evening began like any other: lively music, dancing, and a few cocktails. This time, though, I let myself go further. The warmth of the alcohol made me feel braver, more at ease, as if the world responded to my every smile. When I finally returned home late at night, the door was left ajar as usual, a sign that my dad was waiting up for me. He was seated in the living room with his laptop, the soft glow of the lamp highlighting his profile. My father always had an air of composure and strength, even late at night. His broad shoulders and toned physique, along with the tattoos peeking from under his shirt sleeves, reflected his dedication to staying in shape. His thick, dark hair was neatly combed, with a few gray strands adding to his charm. I playfully tiptoed into the room and lightly touched his shoulders from behind. "Boo!" I exclaimed, barely able to contain my laughter. My father jumped slightly before laughing himself, leaning forward a bit in genuine amusement. "What are you up to, Amanda?" he asked, catching the scent of my perfume and the alcohol on me. "Just living my best life," I giggled, my head spinning slightly. He rose from his chair and turned to me, gently gripping my shoulders. His hands were warm and strong, as though they were made to shield me from anything. His eyes were filled with tenderness, but suddenly I noticed something else, something unfamiliar. The way his scent surrounded me, the way his smile seemed to dissolve The remnants of my intoxication made me freeze. My laughter faded as I met his gaze. In his eyes, I saw everything: care, love, and a hint of gentle reproach. But there was something more, something unspoken, that left me utterly still. I quickly stepped back, forcing a laugh to lighten the mood. "You're always so serious. Relax," I said with a dismissive wave before retreating to my room. Once inside, with the door shut, I lay on my bed for what felt like ages, an indescribable feeling swirling within me. His voice, calm yet slightly firm, interrupted my thoughts. "Lily, go take a shower. You need to freshen up a bit," he said, tilting his head slightly. I nodded, trying to avoid looking at his muscular arms crossed over his chest. My heart raced. His care always felt like more than just responsibility, but this time it seemed to carry a different tone. I headed to the bathroom, leaving the door open, a gesture that had always felt natural between us due to the trust we shared. Turning on the shower, I let the hot water pour over me, blending with my tangled thoughts. As I stood under the stream, I couldn't stop thinking about him. His hands, which had so effortlessly held me earlier, and his smile that seemed to linger in the deepest corners of my mind. Each droplet of water felt like a trace of his touch. The warm spray flowed over my neck and shoulders, moving slowly downward, filling me with a strange heat. His image consumed my thoughts. I tried to focus on the water and the sound of it hitting the tiles, but his smile and voice replayed endlessly in my mind. Suddenly, through the crack in the door, I noticed movement. My father was standing there, watching me. His expression was soft, attentive, with a faint smile, as though he couldn't quite understand how he had ended up there. My heart stopped. I held my breath, but made no effort to hide. The water continued cascading over me, but now it felt different, as if his gaze added warmth to every drop. We locked eyes, and it felt as though time itself had stopped. From a young age, my father and I had always communicated through unspoken glances. His warm smile had been my most treasured memory. I vividly recalled how, when I was little, he would lean down, teasingly say, "Lily, you're my favorite person in the whole world," and then wait for my reply, "And you're mine." He always made time for us, no matter what. We often strolled through the park, hand in hand, as if shielding one another from the world. I cherished those moments most when we'd stop at the little ice cream shop. "Chocolate," he'd say with a grin that revealed the charming dimple on his cheek. Without fail, I'd choose chocolate too, as though it was an unspoken tradition between us. Even when the ice cream melted onto my hands, he'd laugh and gently wipe them clean with a napkin. Despite everything, he never spoke ill of my mother, even after she abandoned us. "She chose a different life," he'd say. "But that doesn't mean you weren't important to her." I knew it wasn't true. I saw the pain in his eyes whenever someone mentioned her name. He tried so hard to mask it, so it wouldn't affect me. Over the years, my anger toward her grew, but he never encouraged it. He taught me kindness, even when there seemed to be little left in his heart. Reflecting on those moments, I realized how much he shaped my world. His love, his care, his unwavering support. The water continued streaming over me, thin rivulets trailing down my body as a wave of awareness washed over me. He was still there, standing in the doorway. His smile seemed to carry an apology for intruding, yet he didn't avert his gaze. I felt embarrassed, but in a soft, almost timid voice, I said, "Come in." He hesitated, then stepped into the bathroom. His eyes briefly flicked toward me before quickly looking away. Grabbing a towel from the chair beside him, he said, "You're soaked. Let me help." His voice was steady, familiar, but there was a hint of tension. He approached carefully, as though afraid to startle me, and began drying me off. First, he dabbed at my shoulders, then my arms, moving lower with slow, deliberate movements. His touch, once so familiar, now felt strangely new. I looked at him, the defined cheekbones, the strong jaw, and felt a stirring inside me that I couldn't name. Every motion he made was gentle yet intentional. He leaned in, wiping droplets from my neck, his warm breath grazing my skin. A thrill ran through me as if we'd stepped into a different world, one without rules or boundaries. "This is wrong," a voice in my mind screamed. "It's forbidden, unacceptable." Yet I couldn't tear my gaze away. His body, once a familiar sight, now seemed entirely different. Muscles well defined beneath his shirt, tattoos peeking from under the sleeves. He'd always been in shape, but I'd never allowed myself to notice. My heartbeat quickened, and he seemed to sense it. He paused, still holding the towel, and his eyes met mine. For a moment, everything, rules, norms, the world, seemed to dissolve. His hands, warm and strong, moved to dry my hair. I felt the tension that had built up within me gradually melt away as his fingers moved softly over my hair, smoothing the strands. His touch was so gentle that I couldn't resist closing my eyes. Although water still dripped from the ends of my hair, each deliberate motion of his hand seemed to hold the intent to make this moment linger endlessly. When his fingers accidentally brushed the skin on my neck, a wave of warmth surged through me, spreading to every part of my body. The strain in my shoulders faded, and it felt as though every part of me relaxed under his soothing touch. The bathroom, illuminated by a warm glow, seemed to transform into an entirely different space, small, enclosed, and removed from the outside world. "Does that feel better?" he asked, his voice soft, barely audible, and incredibly close. I nodded slightly, keeping my eyes shut. My breathing was steady, but my heartbeat still raced, fluttering lightly like the wings of a bee. There was something in his touch, more than just kindness. The way his hands paused for a brief moment before continuing revealed an emotion deeper than care. "You need to rest," he said after a short silence, draping the towel over my shoulders. I opened my eyes, glancing up at him. His face was so close, and his eyes held a depth that left me breathless. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice barely recognizable. He smiled, the slight wrinkle near his cheek giving his expression a familiar warmth. That smile, which had always been a source of comfort, now sparked something much stronger. The moment felt fragile, almost dreamlike, yet so vivid that I knew I would never forget it. We were standing close, so close that I could hear the rhythm of his breathing, warm and steady, blending with the sound of droplets falling from my hair. My thoughts swirled uncontrollably, mirroring the water pooling at our feet. Time seemed to have stopped, leaving just the two of us in this secluded space. My eyes searched his, and there was something in his gaze I hadn't noticed before. Or perhaps I'd refused to acknowledge it until now. It wasn't just care or love. It was something more profound, something that shattered the mental walls I had spent so long building. I couldn't tell who made the first move, whether it was me or him, but perhaps it was unavoidable. Leaning forward, I felt my heart racing in my chest as my breath caught for a moment. When my lips met his, there was a brief second when I thought he might pull away, but he didn't. Instead, his hands gently rested on my shoulders before pulling me closer. He returned the kiss, tenderly yet firmly, as if telling me he wanted this too. Everything around us that could have tied us to reality faded. There were no rules, no constraints, no barriers, only the overwhelming feeling that wrapped around us like the warm steam in the air. My heart overflowed with a newfound emotion, powerful and unstoppable. His warmth, his touch, had become an inseparable part of me. It no longer felt wrong. It was as natural as the act of breathing. As we pulled apart, his gaze deepened, looking at me as though he was truly seeing something that had always been hidden. "Lily," he said, his voice rough but filled with tenderness. In that moment, I realized nothing would ever be the same again. His hands gripped my waist firmly, and another wave of heat coursed through me. It wasn't the chaotic dizziness I'd felt earlier in the evening. This was entirely different. My heartbeat synchronized with his, and every touch intensified the connection between us. When I met his eyes, there was no longer any doubt in his expression. Everything I had suppressed, all the feelings I had tried to ignore, had surfaced, no longer confined. He felt it too. I could see it in the way he looked at me and in how his hands hesitated as though uncertain yet unable to stop. My mind was clear. The haze of alcohol had long faded, but now I was intoxicated by something far more potent, a passion that consumed us both. My breathing grew heavier as he pulled me closer. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and cautious, as if afraid to shatter the delicate moment. I nodded, but somehow even that felt insufficient. I placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat thudding as fiercely as my own. "Yes," I whispered softly. His hands moved upward, gliding along my sides with a cautious touch. He held me as though afraid I might vanish like mist at dawn. But I was fully present. Every part of me was alive, existing solely for this moment. Water continued to cascade down as he lifted me out of the bathroom. The air outside felt cool against the heat of our bodies, but all I could sense was him. His footsteps were quiet yet assured as he carried me into his room. Placing me gently on the bed, he moved with a reverence that made it seem like a sacred ritual, something too delicate to be rushed. His hand brushed my face, resting under my chin as he leaned closer to meet my gaze. "Lily," he murmured, his voice deep and tender. I pulled him closer, unable to bear even a moment apart. There was nothing left to hold us back. In that instant, we became one, not just out of passion, but an acknowledgement of something that had always been between us. The stillness in the room was almost tangible, broken only by the rhythm of our breathing. The faint light filtering through the curtains wrapped us in warmth, creating a sense that this moment existed beyond time itself. The bed beneath us felt like an island in a vast sea, the rest of the world left far behind. As he leaned in, his breath brushed against my skin. His hand explored my body, steady and gentle, tracing every curve as though memorizing it. His touch was so delicate that my entire being seemed to respond, every nerve alive with warmth. My heart pounded so loudly that I was certain he could hear it, but his gaze remained calm, filled with infinite tenderness. His eyes held such depth that I felt exposed, not just physically, but in a way that stripped me bare. His fingers lightly brushed my face, tracing my cheeks before pausing at my chin. Lifting my head slightly, he looked into my eyes, and in that silent exchange, we both understood there was nothing holding us back anymore. He bent down, and our lips met once more. But this time, the kiss was different. It was slower, deeper, overflowing with a tenderness that left me breathless. His hands moved down my shoulders, each touch deliberate and filled with meaning. I lost myself completely under his touch, his understanding of my feelings so precise that my body trembled beneath him. The space between us grew warmer, charged with an invisible energy that felt almost magical. Every movement was slow, careful, as though we wanted to capture every second and etch it into memory. In this moment, we were entirely united, surrounded by an honesty that left no room for anything but us. His warmth enveloped me, and I knew I would never forget this night. Lying side by side, we were wrapped in silence, but it wasn't the kind that felt heavy. This silence spoke volumes, saying more than words ever could. His hand rested gently on my waist as I stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything that had just unfolded. My thoughts were tangled, caught between reality and the weight of what this meant. Yet I felt no shame, no regret, only the peace and comfort he had always brought into my life. Turning my head, I looked at him. His face was calm, but the emotion in his eyes said more than any words could. "I know," he said quietly, as if he already understood what I wanted to say. I feel it too. Maybe it's wrong, but he trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished, though it felt unnecessary to say more. Everything had already been spoken through our actions, our touches, and the way we looked at each other. What now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, unable to look away from him. His expression softened, and he smiled faintly, his fingers brushing through my hair. There's no rush, he replied. We'll live as we always have. But now, we know. I nodded, understanding. This moment was ours alone, a secret no one else would ever know. Though I knew I could never forget it or bury it deep inside, it had become an inseparable part of me. He pulled me closer, and I rested my head on his shoulder. His heartbeat, steady and calm, eased my racing thoughts. While there were still so many unanswered questions ahead, one thing had become clear. This was our moment, our truth, and nothing could take it from us. The space between us seemed to shift, gradually filling with something new, something invisible yet incredibly powerful. The silence was no longer oppressive. It became a quiet witness to what no one else could understand. His hand gently stroked my waist, as though reminding me that this wasn't a dream, but the reality we had chosen to embrace. I studied his face, searching for confirmation that he felt the same, and I found it in the creases near his eyes and the faint, peaceful curve of his lips. Do you regret it? I asked hesitantly, my voice barely audible. His eyes locked with mine, steady and confident. Regret? No, Lily, not about what's real, he said, his words dissolving the last traces of doubt. We didn't talk about the future or make plans, but I knew this moment would stay with us forever. I closed my eyes, feeling his breath mingle with mine. The world outside felt quieter, calmer, and even though we didn't know what lay ahead, I was certain of one thing. This moment belonged to us alone. His fingers trailed along my waist, leaving a lingering warmth that seemed to reach every part of me. His breath grazed my skin, and I felt overwhelmed, as though we had become one whole, inseparable from one another.